Thank you to everyone attending this webinar today on the CVE 2019-197-81 vulnerability that affected thousands of Citrix ADC appliances worldwide in January of this year. What you'll get from my session today is an overview of the CVE 2019-197-81 vulnerability, which will include when it was first discovered, what Citrix products did it affect, how long had it been in Citrix products, how the exploit worked, how it was fixed by Citrix, and how easy was it to exploit. I will then walk through a demo of how easy it was to exploit this vulnerability and how an attacker could have then used the credentials they found in the ADC configuration files to access a Citrix virtual apps and desktop environment and then take control of the domain. Finally, I will go over how you can mitigate any potential Citrix ADC vulnerabilities so as to protect your company in the future. I'll give you a little overview about myself. I'm Dan Challoner and I'm the Head of Technology at Access Systems. I also carry out consultancy work for Access Systems and develop new services and product lines. I've been with Access Systems now for 8 years and I have experience of working with Citrix products for 19 years now, from the days of Metaframe, with my first big experience being with Metaframe XP back in 2002. Since then, I've used every Citrix product and always back this up with the appropriate certification. I currently hold the highest certifications for Citrix in virtualization, mobility, and networking. I have also been working in depth with security since 2008, and I'm a CREST registered penetration tester, and I am an offensive security certified professional. So, what is CVE 2019-19781? Well, Citrix first notified everyone of this vulnerability via a Citrix security bulletin that was released on the Tuesday the 17th of December 2019. The security bulletin contained mitigation steps advising that the mitigation that consisted of a rewrite action and responder policy be applied as soon as possible to eliminate any threat. The vulnerability allowed remote code execution directly against the public Citrix ADC VPN gateway, and thus, if a proof of concept exploit was created at this time, then an attacker would be able to access the operating system of the Citrix ADC. Looking at the versions of Citrix ADC that were affected, it appeared that this vulnerability had existed in the Citrix ADC product since 2014, which is very worrying as there could have been potentially nation-state actors holding a zero-day exploit for this vulnerability and could have been used to infiltrate the networks of companies they wish to attack. At the time this vulnerability was released, scans using Shodan were detecting around 80,000 Citrix ADCs worldwide were affected by this vulnerability, and thus required the mitigation applying immediately. On the 9th of January 2020, a public exploit was created with an available scanner. At this time, Shodan was still showing that over 60,000 Citrix ADCs had still not had the mitigation steps applied to them, and thus they were now vulnerable to attack with this exploit. Within minutes of the exploit being made public, mass scanning was being performed to find vulnerable Citrix ADC gateways, and the exploit was run against them to gain access. It was advised that any Citrix ADC that didn't have the mitigation applied to them before the 1st of January 2020 should be considered as being breached due to this vulnerability, and all Citrix ADCs that we checked had been breached by multiple attackers. All Citrix ADCs that did not have the mitigation applied had to be shut down and destroyed, and new Citrix ADC appliances built to replace them with the mitigation applied to them. At this moment, there is still over 5,000 ADCs being reported unpatched and vulnerable, all of which have been breached by attackers. The Citrix products that were affected were Citrix ADC, formerly Citrix NetScaler, Citrix ADC Gateway, formerly Citrix NetScaler Gateway, and Citrix SD-WAN, For Citrix ADC and Citrix ADC Gateway, the builds before 13.0.47.24, 12.1.55.18, 12.0.63.13, 11.1.63.15 and 10.5.70.12 were all affected and should have had the mitigation applied to them. For Citrix SD-WAN, the software release builds before 10.6.6b and 11.0.3b were all affected and should have had the mitigation applied to them. So how the exploit worked. The initial mitigation showed that directory traversal could be used as a HTTP request for // and /VPNS/ were being blocked by the mitigation steps on the ADC. The ADCs allowed unsanitized import and didn't do enough sanitizing of the import, which is bad, and the Citrix developers should have done a better job on this. Remote file insertion was allowed, and the proof of concept exploit could create an XML file containing a malicious payload. The proof of concept exploit could then issue commands that would cause indirect file execution of the XML files containing the malicious payload. The attack allowed unauthenticated arbitrary code execution, which in itself is bad enough, but if it's at least authenticated, then we're dealing with a trusted or semi-trusted user. Unauthenticated means somebody out there on the internet is tricking that system into running code that arbitrary instruction without even having cracked or stolen any authentication or guessed a password or anything else. This is about the worst case scenario type of vulnerability that you could have. The first security bulletin advised applying a rewrite action and responded to correct this vulnerability. On the 19th of January 2020, new firmware releases that fixed the vulnerability were made available for the Citrix ADC versions 11.1 and 12.0. New firmware was released for versions 12.1 and 13.0 on the 23rd of January. New firmware was released for version 10.5 on the 24th of January 2020, and the advice was to upgrade immediately to these new versions of the firmware. Firmware was released for Citrix SD-WAN release on the 22nd of January 2020 for releases 10.2.6b and 11.0.3b. So how easy was it to exploit? Exploiting a Citrix ADC or SD-WAN appliance was very easy to achieve and has a NIST rating of 9.8 and could easily be done by anyone with a very basic knowledge such as script kiddies. The steps were: Step 1, find a publicly available Citrix ADC VPN gateway, which we were able to do by downloading the proof of concept and running the scanner, or you could run a Citrix Google search engine search and look through the search index for Citrix ADC VPN gateways. Once they had a list of Citrix ADC VPN gateways, they could go onto GitHub site where they could get the exploit and scanner Python scripts were located and download both of them. Then they would run the scanner script against the first Citrix ADC VPN gateway in their list to check whether it is vulnerable. If a Citrix ADC VPN gateway was vulnerable, then they would start a listener such as a Netcat listener and then run the exploit against the Citrix ADC VPN gateway. A connection would then be made back from the Citrix ADC VPN gateway to the Netcat listener, and an interactive session would start, meaning the attacker had access to the operating system. The attacker could now explore the file system for sensitive and interesting files. They could enumerate the systems and look for ways to elevate their privilege to the root user, so that they can install other software such as crypto miners or other software to maintain persistency in the case that the initial vulnerability is fixed. Or the attacker could look at ways of traversing into other systems within the network from that Citrix ADC appliance. So how was the exploit used? Well, now that the attacker had a session on the appliance, they could do the following. Explore the file system for sensitive and interesting files, looking for credentials such as usernames, passwords and password hashes that they could steal and use on other systems. They could also enumerate and find DNS names and IP addresses of other systems. The attacker could look at the Citrix ADC appliance as a stepping stone. This would allow them to traverse onto other systems and segments within the network and to gain further control. Another option from a enumerated operating system would be to look for ways to elevate privilege to root so that they can install other software such as crypto miners, which I received a lot of reports of people finding installed on their appliances, or other software to maintain persistency in case the initial vulnerability is fixed. One such piece of software I found installed was called Think PHP that had a vulnerability in it, and there were connections coming in from China even though the ADC mitigation had been applied. The attackers also created cron jobs, scheduled tasks on the ADC appliances. One such cron job I saw downloaded and executed a script from a Russian web server every hour that would make a copy of the nsconfig directory and export it to the temp directory. And directories would then be zipped up and then sent over to the web server as part of the script action. The final part of the script would be to delete all the contents of the temp directory so there was no evidence of the files in there. So what I'll do now is run through a demo of how an attacker would exploit an ADC appliance and then be able to gain access to other systems within the customer network. Okay, so as I mentioned before, the first step will be to find a publicly available Citrix ADC VPN gateway, such as being used by Google search engine. In my example here I found the Citrix ADC VPN gateway called portal.citrixhotspot.com. As you can see, the login only requires a username and password, so if I can find any credentials once I have access to the ADC file system, there's a good chance I'll be able to log in. So what I've done already is downloaded the scanner and the exploit POC files. So the first thing I've done here is on my attacker machine is run the scanner against my portal.citrixhotspot.com gateway. And as you can see here, there's a message that says this Citrix ADC server portal.citrixhotspot.com is still vulnerable to CVE 2019-19781. This means that I can now try to run the exploit against the gateway as it is vulnerable. So the next thing I will do, I'll start a netcat listener on my attacker machine, which will listen on TCP port 444. So here, just in the right hand screen, you can see we're starting the listener there. So that's now listening, and then the next stage is to run the exploit against the Citrix ADC VPN gateway. So in the left hand screen, I will now put run the exploit. There we go, so the exploit command's there, it's starting to go through, and then in the right hand screen we've now got a connection there. So yeah, you can see the interactive session there in the right hand screen, which you can see I've got the $sign, which I will now start to enter commands into that box. So the first thing I'll do is check what directory I'm in, which should be the root directory, and then I can view the contents of that directory. So if I do a pwd there, so I'm in the root, and then the ls shows all the directories in there. So the one I'm interested in here is the nsconfig directory. So if we go inside that directory, and then as you can see, listing the content shows the ns.conf file, which contains the ADC configuration file. Okay, so the ADC configuration file's there. So from there, I can search the ns.conf file for LDAP actions. So all I'm doing is cat in that file and then doing a grep LDAP action. And this will show things like the domain controller IP address in there. So as you can see, the domain controller IP address is there, 192.168.22.10. And also within here, we'll have things like the LDAP lookup user account. This one is using the domain administrator, which is a good example because quite a lot of Netscalers I found were using that account. And then we also have the password hash for the administrator account, domain administrator account that is. And what we can do with that password is actually we can take the hash and we can reverse engineer it using a simple Python script and then convert the hash to the actual password. So if I exit out that now, that kills the actual session. So now I'll decrypt that password hash. Just copy that in there, paste it in, and as you can see there, the password is there, which is just capital P at SSW0RD. So now we've got those credentials there. I'll just copy that into my notepad file. So we can go back to the login page and try the credentials. As you can see, that logs me in, and I can actually see the desktops and applications on there. And that's quite a common scenario where the group domain users is just given to access to resources. Ideally, security groups should be used, and the only standard user account allowed to access the resources there. So I've launched that desktop and it's gone in. So what I'm going to do now, because we have the IP address of domain controller, we can see if the remote desktop client is now available. So try running MSTC, and then we can type in our domain controller IP. Yeah, so we've got that there, 22.10, and then we can try and log in with our administrator username and password. And as you can see, that lets me straight on there. So now that I'm logged in, I really don't want to let the IT team know that I'm using the administrator account, as it may flag up as being used and raise suspicions. So what I can do is go into Active Directory Users Computers and create a new user. And then with this account, once I've created it, I can add that into the domain admin group. And instead of using the administrator anymore, I can use this other account and then carry out further attacks on the network and other systems. So just complete that there, and then the final thing is just go into properties and then go into member of and add it into the domain admins. And then from here on, I can use this account or other accounts that I create to maintain persistency in the customers in the environment of the customer. Okay. And that's that done. Yeah, so the account there has been created and stuff, and we've fully taken control of the domain. So how do we mitigate future vulnerabilities? Well, the first recommendation I would make would be to subscribe to the Citrix security bulletins so that you're aware of vulnerabilities as soon as they are announced by Citrix. We found that most companies were not signed up to these Citrix bulletins and thus were unaware of the CVE 2019-19781 or its seriousness. The second recommendation would be to act upon the Citrix advice immediately. CVE 2019-19781 showed that most companies did not act straight away or didn't act at all to apply the mitigations. And with the exploit POC being produced in 23 days after the announcement, this led to 75% of the world's Citrix ADC appliances being compromised by a security breach. The third recommendation is do not use credentials for LDAP lookups that is a privileged account. Use a standard domain user account for the lookups. That is all that is required. Administrator or domain admin accounts should never be used. The fourth recommendation is if you have Citrix NetScaler Enterprise or Citrix ADC Advanced licenses, then you can use Storefront to provide the gateway authentication rather than using LDAP lookups, and thus no LDAP credentials will be stored on your ADC configuration file. The fifth recommendation is to use two-factor authentication. As you saw in this demo, if two-factor authentication had been in place, even though the attacker had the administrator credentials, they would still not have been able to log in with two-factor authentication in place. The sixth recommendation is to restrict access to applications and desktops to users that are not privileged accounts. Individual groups should be created for specific access to desktops and applications, and groups such as domain users and domain admins should never be used. The seventh recommendation is to implement systems such as system information and event management systems, intrusion detection systems, and firewall traffic alerts. These will allow you to see if user accounts are being used in places where they would not be expected to be used. You can also see unexpected traffic, possibly in large quantities, say maybe from countries like China, Russia, the USA, and Iran, and patterns of behavior as well that can be picked up by next generation firewalls. The eighth recommendation was something we noticed a lot when restoring ADC appliances for customers, which was that only a few had good recent configuration backups out of their ADC appliances. Backing up the configuration files allows for a quick restoration and means that the latest settings will be in the configuration backup as well as files such as the latest SSL certificates. Thank you for watching this, and I hope that it has been of interest to everyone.